And here the Met was modelled on the ironically named Peace Protection Force, created to assist the continued colonization of Ireland in 1814. So just as a bit of background for those who may be unfamiliar with the system of colonization in Ireland, it was premised on the dispossessing of Irish Catholic peasants of their land and making them pay rents to primarily English and Scottish Protestant landlords. These rents were most often paid through the sale of high-value grains like oats and barley, referred to as money crops, which were in turn exported to the British mainland, leaving Irish peasants reliant on potatoes for food, a low-value crop that could grow even on rocky terrain. This, of course, meant that Irish peasants were incredibly vulnerable to any failures in the potato crops, since colonial landlords in Ireland not only continued to insist on the payment of rent in years of crop failure, but frequently increased the rents, leading to a number of famines, ultimately culminating infamously in the Great Famine of 1845, which killed around a quarter of the Irish population, essentially through colonially mandated starvation. And it's about 30 years before the Great Famine that the Peace Protection Force are created by the British government in Ireland to help quell rebellion from nationalist Irish groups and ensure that the British Crown was able to continue extracting both rent and mandatory grain exports from Irish peasants. The Peace Protection Force was essentially a completely militarized police force, often staffed by British ex-military, that was deployed to specific areas in Ireland where local magistrates had requested their presence in order to reassert colonial law and order. And it's here that we get the real commonality between the Peace Protection Force in Ireland and its successor, the Metropolitan Police. Not only were the PPF a militarized police force, but their actions were given like the veneer of acceptability by appearing to constitute a form of policing by consent, since the magistrates had to request their presence. Although, of course, the consent did not come from the Irish peasant class, but rather the Irish upper class from which the magistrates hailed. This same emphasis on the veneer of consent was central to the so-called core principles of the Metropolitan Police, as laid out in the Metropolitan Policing Act of 1829. So, when the Met was formally established some 15 years later, they essentially constituted a watered-down model of the PPF. There was awareness that a visibly militarized standing presence in English cities would draw criticism, and so there were like these conscious attempts to differentiate the uniforms of the Met Police from military officials, such as by giving them like top hats and tailcoats. They also were not armed with guns, as the PPF were. Instead, they carried truncheons. However, the similarities were not lost on the British public at the time, with one Weekly Dispatch article decrying these quote-unquote military protectors of our civil liberties, and a monthly magazine article labeling the Met as a quote military retainer of the Duke of Wellington. But here's the crucial bit, right? It's not just that the new Met's, structures of hierarchy, applications of divide and rule, and information gathering tactics and militarized approach had a similar vibe to policing in Ireland, albeit in a more watered down format to make it palatable to the English population. It's that the people involved in coming up with these ideas were directly involved in these colonization efforts. So Patrick Colquhoun, whose treatise on the policing of the metropolis that I quoted from earlier, was directly involved in the system of human enslavement in the Americas and the Caribbean. So when he was 15, Colquhoun had emigrated to the slave colony of Virginia. What exactly he did while he was there is unclear, but what is clear is that by the time he returned to the UK, he had created a number of connections with slave plantations, which allowed him to establish a lucrative import-export business on his return to the UK, trading in the commodities produced by enslaved people in Virginia. But it goes even further than this. Colquhoun was the formal representative of the West Indian slave planter interest in London and actively lobbied the government to protect these interests throughout his lifetime. In fact, his entire reason in calling for the establishment of a former police force in London was to protect the goods of the slavers that were being looted in London ports. Similarly, it was one guy who was responsible for creating both the Colonial Police Protection Force in Ireland and the London Metropolitan Police. And that man is former UK Secretary of Ireland turned Home Secretary turned Prime Minister, who I mentioned earlier, A1 Robert Peel. These two men were both intimately acquainted with and directly involved with policing systems in the colonies, and they imported this learning to be applied within the UK. And here's the final caveat of this section, right? I'm not trying to say that the white British working class were policed with the same brutality that Irish peasants and black enslaved laborers were. These systems had to be watered down in order to be palatable enough for the British public. However, we also have to remember that not everyone in Britain at this time was white. And when it comes to groups living in Britain who were racialized to this level of subhuman, I would say that the treatment that they received at the hands of the Met was just as brutal. And we see echoes of this legacy also today, where the burden of colonially inspired police brutality, both here and in places like the United States, who in the mid-1800s imported almost wholesale the Met police model, falls much harder on some groups than others. So when people say that the police are institutionally racist, this is why that is, right? This is the history that this system comes from. Right, that was a lot of history. So if you're still here with me, thanks very much for sticking with it.